interesting case for you today, which is about the veto power in the UN Security Council. So right now, there are 15 countries on the Security Council, but 5 of them, France, Russia, England, the US, and China, all have veto power. And I'm going to be arguing that they shouldn't have this veto power and that the Security Council should just essentially function a different way. So why is this? So the thing is, the veto power in the Security Council is more a legacy left over from World War II of the winners. Like I said, it's France, Russia, England, the US, and China. And not actually because it's an effective way to run the UN. We think it's problematic because it creates a lot of stalemates, and that, if China doesn't want something to happen, they'll just essentially veto it. And even if the other 4 countries, even if every other single country in the UN would rather have this happen, they're unable to pass these resolutions. This also makes countries act more conservatively or not implement policies that would be a good idea or even bring them up in the UN, because they know they'll ultimately be vetoed by the Security Council or one member on the Security Council, and that it'll ultimately be useless. We think this is also problematic for the UN because essentially it gives the perception that they're not equitable, because right now they're not, because they're really representing the interests of 5 countries that just happen to be lucky enough to be on the right side of World War II after they created the UN, as opposed to everyone. But also it creates a lot of stalemates, which decreases people's trust, especially countries that you want on board, like these bigger countries, in the UN, and essentially makes the UN even less effective. And so we think that if you wanted to more evenly distribute the power and actually make the UN a more effective governing body, that you would get rid of the veto on the Security Council or change the format so it's not just these 5 countries.
So admittedly, it doesn't make a lot of sense for France to be on the Security Council if Germany is not, because right now, if you see what's going on in the EU, Germany is a lot more financially secure than France, than Portugal, and a ton of other countries. But that's not really what we have to defend today. So the case is just get rid of the veto power on the UN Security Council. Now, I think the idea of having a veto on the Security Council is actually enormously useful, because the UN Security Council inherently has a lot more power than the General Assembly or any of the other branches of the United Nations. The reason why this is true is because the UN Security Council can pass binding resolutions that hold the member states obligated to do a certain number of things, like put troops on the ground, send in peacekeepers, uphold sanctions, and that sort of thing. And a famous philosopher once said, "With great power comes great responsibility." So I think it's really important that when an arm of the United Nations has more power, there are more responsibility, there are more checks on this power. I think having the veto power, in some cases can lead to stalemates, but consider that I think that in most cases when stalemates happen, they're probably going to be about really controversial things that maybe the UN Security Council may or may not have an actual interest in doing in the long run. The second thing is that having veto power provides sort of like a guarantee that we have the economic and political will to follow through the types of things that the UN Security Council does pass. Because the United States doesn't support putting troops on the ground, the United States probably isn't going to fund the troops on the ground. That's problematic.
So I think essentially that Denise just lost that right there, because all she did was talk about philosophers, some great philosophers that she can't even name, but also the fact that she basically says in her first sentence, she admits that having certain countries on the Security Council isn't the way it should be, that it doesn't make sense given the global order. And so, first off, I agree, it isn't an effective system. But then the only sort of argument she gives of why you should keep it is that it's useful, because she says the Security Council has more power than any other branches because they can do things. She gives a lot of really interesting facts about troops and sanctions. But the problem with this is that essentially that's why there shouldn't be this veto power, because you have the most powerful branch, arguably the only branch that can do anything, and you have it representing the interests of 5 archaic countries, or 5 countries that are only on there again because of sort of the post-World War II political system that existed, and they essentially built the UN, so they said, and we're going to build this thing called the Security Council and give ourselves all the power to this veto function and other sort of responsibilities of the Security Council, so that the UN ultimately isn't representing all the nations. She says that we need checks on this power, but the thing is the veto isn't a check, it just creates stalemates. And she says, well, it's only going to be about things that are controversial, so it's probably a good thing because you need political and economic will. Or it could be on stuff that other countries just don't want. For example, you could probably, it's probably in the best interest to protect things like human rights. But China doesn't want to get in trouble for that. And so human rights aren't controversial. That's something we all agree is a good thing. But you might have a country like China or Russia or even the United States, after everything we just found out about Libya, saying that they don't want human rights. So it just creates stalemate, not in an effective way. Get rid of the veto.
So I don't think every member state of the UN genuinely believes that the UN is the catch-all solution to all the world's problems. I don't think that's the UN's function. I think the primary benefit of having the UN is that it provides a forum for arbitration, for moderating debates, so we don't have things like World War III and things like that. I think that having the veto on the Security Council uniquely protects the UN Security Council from doing really reckless things, or maybe from doing things that it's not appropriate for the UNSC to be doing. Maybe there are some cases where we need to send in troops, Also, consider that there are enormous limitations on what the UN can do. Like, peacekeepers can't fire first. They can only shoot back when they're shot at. It's not appropriate to send a peacekeeper into every single situation when you have militarized guys on the ground running around, because they're probably going to be killed. In cases like that, it's probably more appropriate to use NATO or use bilateral or multilateral alliances outside of the UN. So given that all of these things are true, there's only a certain, like, I think there are a finite number of circumstances and a finite number of resources the UN Security Council has access to. I think that given that all of those things are true, and that you still do need a lot of political will, an enormous amount of economic will to make sure that what the UN Security Council says is actually going to be implemented on the ground. It's enormously, you need to have like certain countries like the US, like Russia, like China on your side, because those are ultimately the countries that are going to be funding these types of endeavors. If you don't have the US's support for something, you're just not going to be able to get, like, the UN Security Council is going to be passing a bunch of toothless resolutions. I think that's going to be even more detrimental to the UN Security Council, because consider that this is like one unique branch of the UN. Everyone sort of looks up to the Security Council to like make good decisions. They're making